Hey guys, it's Karen V from Valori Huntress. So today is going to be another episode on hunting terms. So specifically this episode is going to be all about antlers. If you guys aren't subscribed, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it. So really quick, I just wanted to tell you the difference, like in really brief difference in antlers versus horns. So antlers, really quick, just so you guys know, is all bone. So this is an antler, this is all bone. And these are only found on certain types of animals, big game animals. What makes it different than a horn is this bone. That's all it is. It is actual bone, and it falls off once a year, and it repeats every single year. So you'll see deer without the antler for some time, versus horns are like this guy right here. This is off of an antelope. This is made out of a texture called keratin. Keratin is what's in our nails, what makes up our hair, and in other animals it makes up hoofs and things like that. But when it comes to horns, horns are just going to be made out of keratin, and they do not shed except for pronghorn, but we'll get into that in the video that I'm going to do about horns on a different day. But these do not fall off, unlike antlers that are made of bone that do fall off. So that's just a really quick difference in which one we're going to talk about today. So today is all about antlers. So there's four main types of animals that have antlers. The first is going to be elk, then we have moose, deer, and caribou. Those are the main four in the North American continent that have antlers. Yes, we do have other creatures like stags and everything, but those are still in the deer family. So when it comes to deer, there's still multiple different kinds. There's whitetail, there's blacktail, there's mule deer, there's coos, there's Sitka blacktail. Either way, I'm just gonna do a broad spectrum of deer and things like that. Another really cool thing is if you want to go on to booneandcrockett.com, which I'll have the link down below, you can go on there and see how you're supposed to actually measure a antler. So for instance, you can look up things with horns, you can look up for how to measure a bear skull correctly, like all sorts of things. And if you do think you have an animal that will score big enough, you can actually go online and figure out the steps to try and get it measured professionally and see if you can get in the book. But that's something for a different day. So when it comes to going online and looking at these, they'll tell you which beams are certain things, which I'll go over that in a second. But really quick, you'll also notice that there is this thing called non-typical and typical. When you say, hey, I got a typical, it means the correct looking, typical way of the antler being grown. Because every species has a generic way that the antler is grown. So each antler structure is specific to their species. When you hear somebody say, oh yeah, I got a beautiful non-typical, that is a way of saying that the antler did not form in a typical manner. Is not right looking. It can have like a droop in it. Like if you look here, it's awkward looking, but it's still cool, of course. It's just not the normal way. So it's called a non-typical. And then there's such things as garbage. Now, when you have an animal like deer, for instance, we're going to talk about, that has what's called garbage. That is when the antler still looks normal, like we have the main beam and everything. We have it forking off like it should. Right here, we have what's called garbage because it's almost like hollow right there and it's not normal. This will make you lose points for a typical. This is not considered a non-typical. It is considered a typical with garbage, which truthfully, I love it when they have garbage. It is so cool to see what happened and everything. And just so you guys know, some things that can cause garbage is when they are in velvet. So this is one of my dad's Blacktail Deer. It is just a forky, which I'll again go over that one in a minute. But it has, if you ever see a deer and you have, or a moose or an elk, and there's this fuzzy looking texture on it, that is the velvet. Now, if you look here, it's just this fuzzy little stuff. that is the velvet. It's a fur that goes over the antler. So what happens is after the antler is shed, when it starts to regrow the bone, it'll have the velvet on the outside of it. This time when this happens is when the actually very soft. It can get messed up, like right here, if you can see. It doesn't look very normal. It has what's called cactus, which is when it's just all weird little pricklies and everything. It's not formed normally. And cactus bucks usually have the cactus around here. It doesn't usually, it sometimes can, but it doesn't usually spread up into the main part of the antler. Cactus bucks usually just have it down below, but it's where it's just like a whole bunch of little knobbies that form off of the main beam. And this right here is the main beam right here. It's the part that everything comes off of from there. And the parts that come off, like right here, is considered a tine. So when you're looking at an elk or a moose, any of these are considered a tine. Each of them do have their own name, which I'll go over that in each specific one in just a minute though. But back to velvet. When you're growing the antler and you have the velvet on there, what'll happen is there's actually blood vessels that are underneath this to help bring blood to it, to help grow it and all that good stuff. So what happens is when it's time to rub this off, and a rub is when they rub the antler on something to get this off, because then the antler has become hard. Now, when you look at a normal hard antler, you'll notice that there's lines all through here. That is where the blood vessels were. And when you rub off the velvet, it starts to open up those little blood vessels, and it creates a pigment when this antler will rub on whatever substance is running on, like manzanita brush and so on and so forth. And that's how like sometimes certain antlers may be a little bit darker in pigment because of what they rubbed it on. Now another thing is when you have what's called a fork. A fork is this guy right here, when the antler forks off. Now some people will say, hey, I saw a really good forky out there. That means that the deer had this spread on both sides, and it means that it's a forky buck. It's only two. But then there's what's known as a spike, which is this here, where it's just that main beam. Some areas you can actually harvest a spike, some you can't. It all just depends on your hunting regulations in your area. Now, when it comes to shedding or dropping, after you get the stage of when the velvet comes off and everything, you get the hard antler underneath. Well then, later on in the year, this here will snap off and you'll be left with nothing, and it'll be like this. It's just an antler, and that is known as a shed. People say it as shedding, dropping, things like that, and this is when people do shed hunting. Shed hunting is when you go out into the forest or wherever you have antlered animals and you look for these in the ground, like where they've dropped them. Now just make sure, if you are new to this, some areas you are not actually allowed to pick up sheds. For instance, one of the areas that I live by, over by the ocean, you are not allowed to take any sheds from the land. Don't know why it's a law there for some reason, but it just is the way it is. So just make sure when you go out, you aren't picking up something illegally and everything. Now I'm also going to talk about what a pedicle is. A pedicle is this here. Right here is what is known as the pedicle. Right here. Where the antler meets the skull. Now, when it comes to pedicles, that is the area where it will break off from when you lose your shed. And when it comes to pedicles, something that I actually find very interesting is the fact of when a mother is pregnant with a fawn, if she has had a bad winter, maybe it's been very hard to find food and water while she's pregnant, it will determine the size of the pedicle. If the baby is born, then it'll never be able to get a big rack on it, because the pedicle determines how big the rack's going to be. Even if for some reason you have a miraculous years after that while it's growing up, and there's so much more food and water, when it was in its mother's womb, that determined how big that pedicle was going to get. So it cannot grow any larger than the biology of it, if that makes any sense at all. But that's always some of the things that I love learning about. If you want to go on to booneandcrockett.com, go on there and you just kind of want to learn more about the different structures of the things for antlers. Right here is the first structure, and that's going to be elk. We're going to talk about each different piece in a minute. Here's a structure of moose. Here's a structure of a whitetail deer versus a mule deer, blacktail deer. And then of course caribou right here too. Alrighty, so here is my shearer moose from a couple years back. Now, like I said, these here are considered the tines. This here is considered the palm. Just remember, like the palm of your hand. See, this is the lower palm, this is the upper palm. Now, when it comes to moose, there's a certain way, like I said, about going on to Boone and Crockett website and trying to see how you can score them. When it comes to that, you want to measure from the greatest spread. So from the largest spot over here for the widest part to the widest part over here. So it would be right to about here to here for mine. That is the greater spread area. Then there is number of abnormal points, which mine does not have any. But if there was pieces coming off here, then this would be an abnormal point on a moose. And then it's number of normal points that you're supposed to do. Then you want to measure the palms. But you can see all of this on the Boone and Crockett website. Sorry about the red lighting, but this is my garage. This is Bert, not one of mine. It's actually an old neighbor's. He was moving, he didn't want it. Anyways, not the point. So when it comes to elk, they have certain names for each of those times. This first one, that one there is known as the G1. Again, you can find all this on the Boone and Crockett website and just look up elk. Next one up, that is the G2, G3, that guy right there is G4, G5, and that one right there is G6. Here's what I was just looking at. It shows which ones are which, where you're supposed to measure for the width of the main beam, the size that you're supposed to do for the inner side, the widest point, and the inside for the very back tips. So each of these you can figure out. When it comes to figuring out how many tines certain things have, some people will be like, oh, that has a nice G2. Truthfully, there's only a few people that do that, so it's not like you have to learn each of those tine names, just so you know. You guys not see me? I'm down here. Now, when it comes to mule deer, this is a California mule deer. When people say certain things, this right here is known as the eye guard. So when you're looking straight at them, right here, that is the eye guard. Think of it as the closest thing to the eye. So this guy here only has one eye guard. He broke off his other one, which has little nubbins right there. Next up is the G2. The G2 is this guy right here that I followed all the way up. This guy right here is the G3, the G4, and the F. This here, like I said, is a mule deer. When you look at mule deer, you can tell certain differences. In a different video, I'm going to go over the 3 significant ways to tell which is a mule deer, which is a blacktail deer, like that guy right back there, and which is a whitetail deer. But for right now, we're just gonna be talking about the antlers. Sorry, I'm standing on my sofa. So when it comes to blacktail deer, like I said, the back tine is not as tall, but it still has the main structure. Now my blacktail does not happen to have eye guards. They can, but sometimes they don't grow them. It's just how it is. So this is my blacktail. Now notice the structure, how it comes off of the main beam. Well, if he got a little bit older, he would have then forked right here, just like a mule deer does, because they're super close. Alrighty, so when it comes to whitetail deer, I have never done whitetail deer hunting, I live on the West Coast. I'd like to one of these days. I just haven't had a chance to yet. So really quickly, just like the mule deer and the black-tail deer, you have the F beam, which is pretty much the main beam. Now with the white-tail deer, you then have G2, 3, 4, and 5 that branch off of F. Unlike how I just said with the blacktail and the mule deer, they fork and create 2 more sets and more, where everything with whitetail comes off the actual main beam. And these guys also do have eye guards too, but sometimes you may not get a deer that has eye guards. Also, if you guys are new to my channel, don't forget to go and look up the other hunting terms. I have one about just random words that you'll hear hunters talk about, and that'll be linked down below. So next episode for the hunting terms is going to be all about horns. So stay tuned for that one. Please like and subscribe, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful day. Thanks. Bye.